So, in the human body, an autoimmune disease happens when the very cells that are like designed to fight off an infection become totally confused.
Right, they misidentify a threat.
Exactly. They misidentify a threat and they just start attacking the body's own healing process. And well, in March of 2021, the United Kingdom's legal and social systems suffered what you could basically call a massive autoimmune response.
That's a really apt way to put it, actually.
Yeah, because you had a grieving community trying to heal from just a horrific trauma, and the mechanisms of the state, the laws designed to protect public health, they basically wound up attacking that very attempt at healing.
Right. It was a profound failure of systemic adaptation. I mean, when the strict legal frameworks meant to ensure our physical survival collide with our fundamental psychological need to, like, process grief and demand justice, the fallout is just devastating.
It really is. And well, welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. For you listening, our mission for today's conversation is to basically unpack that exact collision.
Yeah, we are looking at a profoundly complex and, frankly, tragic flashpoint in recent UK history.
Right. We're focusing on the aftermath of the kidnapping and murder of 33-year-old Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And we're going to examine how her death kind of sparked this unprecedented clash between public mourning, a total catastrophic collapse in institutional trust, and, the incredibly rigid COVID-19 lockdown laws that were governing every aspect of daily life back then.
And our analysis today is grounded in two really highly detailed sources.
Right. Tell them what we're looking at.
So the first is a comprehensive data report from the End Violence Against Women Coalition, which quantifies the severe fallout in public trust following the murder.
Yeah, the numbers in that are wild.
They really are. And the second is an official, like, minute-by-minute inspection report from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services.
Which is quite a mouthful.
It is. But essentially, they are the independent watchdog for the police. And this report investigates the policing of the resulting vigil on Clapham Common.
Okay, before we dive into all that, it is really important as we look at these sources to remember our role here.
Absolutely.
We aren't here to, take a political side on the police's actions or the government's policies. The materials we are reviewing contain some highly charged political critiques, and, our goal is not to endorse them. We're just here to impartially report the facts and arguments so you can understand the mechanics of this crisis.
Right. We're basically mapping the territory, showing you how these different institutional and social forces interacted under immense pressure.
Yeah, and the paradox at the center of this map is just staggering. I mean, how does a community safely and legally gather to mourn the victim of a police officer when the people enforcing the emergency pandemic safety laws are the police themselves?
Wow. Yeah. To even begin to untangle that, we have to look at the environment just prior to the vigil being proposed.
Because it wasn't a vacuum.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
We aren't just talking about a community that was sad. We are talking about a community where public trust in law enforcement had already degraded to a dangerously fragile state.
Right. And this was heavily compounded by the police's prior treatment of two murdered sisters, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman.
Oh, God. Yeah, in that case, there had been those horrific revelations about serving police officers taking, like, inappropriate photographs of the victims' bodies.
And sharing them in WhatsApp groups.
Right. Sharing them in WhatsApp groups and using highly offensive, degrading language. It was awful.
So when you take that existing trauma and layer Sarah Everard's murder by a serving officer directly on top of it, the data points to just a total collapse in public confidence.
Yeah, and we have the numbers on that. The End Violence Against Women Coalition, they commissioned a YouGov poll of, I think, 1,699 adults in October 2021 to measure this, right?
Yes, exactly. And the results were, well, stark. 47% of women and 40% of men reported declining trust in the police.
Almost half of all women.
Yeah. And the underlying culture was the primary concern. 76% of women felt that the internal culture of policing had to fundamentally change in order to properly handle violence against women and girls. Out of all the numbers in that report, there is one statistic that I found genuinely chilling.
The one about reporting.
Yes. 1 in 10 women. 10% said they would be less likely to report a sexual assault to the police following the Sarah Everard case.
It's hard to overstate how significant that is.
10% of women effectively declaring they would rather suffer a violent crime in silence than interact with the state apparatus designed to protect them. That's just a broken system.
It really is. That data point represents a systemic crisis of legitimacy.
So how did the government respond?
Well, the government and police leadership did attempt to stem this bleeding of public trust. Priti Patel, who was the Home Secretary at the time, announced £5 million in funding for measures intended to keep women safe.
£5 million. Sounds like a lot.
It does, but this money was earmarked for physical infrastructure, things like more CCTV cameras and better street lighting. Additionally, local forces responded with their own initiatives, like Dorset Police rolled out plans to patrol nightclubs, and the Met launched a lone officer verification scheme.
Which was what exactly?
It was essentially a protocol for the public to verify if an officer approaching them was legitimate, like a hotline or a radio check.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I am, frankly, struggling to understand the government's logic here.
You're not the only one.
Right. Because if the public is screaming that the internal culture of the police is the actual threat, that the officers themselves are the danger, why was the immediate political reflex to give the police more money for cameras and put more patrols on the street?
It seems counterintuitive.
Totally. How does increasing the physical presence of the institution address a rot in its cultural foundation?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the End of Violence Against Women Coalition articulated that exact disconnect.
Oh, they called it out.
Oh, yeah. They argued that the government's reflex toward visible physical security measures fundamentally missed the point.
Right.
From their perspective, these were basically superficial PR exercises. Buying more cameras and authorizing more patrols bypasses the grueling, uncomfortable internal audits required to root out institutional racism and misogyny within the ranks.
Because, I mean, the coalition pointed out a documented history of police committing offenses ranging from deceiving women into intimate relationships to, in this extreme case, murder.
Exactly. And women who attempt to blow the whistle are routinely dismissed or ignored.
Yeah.
Plus, the coalition also highlighted a critical sociological mechanism regarding these quote-unquote safety measures. They argued that deploying more police and surveillance actually creates a secondary hazard.
For who?
For already over-policed Black and ethnic minority communities.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when a demographic's primary experience with the state apparatus is one of disproportionate targeting, increasing that apparatus to supposedly protect them just creates this feedback loop of fear and criminalization.
So it's like the underlying critique was that the state was continually placing the burden on women and marginalized groups to keep themselves safe from the authorities rather than the authorities fixing their own behavior.
That's exactly it.
So you have a society sitting on a powder keg of grief, systemic distrust, and anger about male violence. The community desperately needed a pressure valve.
And this leads directly to a grassroots attempt to organize a safe space to mourn.
Right. But the moment they tried to build that space, they slammed into an impenetrable legal wall.
Yeah, this is where the top line laid out in the official inspection report becomes essential to understanding the escalation.
Walk us through it.
So on Wednesday, March 10th, a small group of women, including local Lambeth counselors and an event management professional, they formed a collective called Reclaim These Streets, or RTS.
Okay.
Their goal was to organize a vigil for Saturday, March 13th on Clapham Common, which is near where Sarah Everard was last seen.
You know, I was struck reading the report by how incredibly methodical their planning was.
They were pros.
Yeah. This was not a spontaneous, chaotic call to just flood a park. They were treating public health with immense respect.
Right, they had a whole system.
They did. They integrated NHS track and trace QR codes into the event planning. They acknowledged local bylaws banning open flames, so they secured 1,000 battery-powered LED tea lights.
Which is such a specific, thoughtful detail.
Right. And they recruited 40 volunteer marshals. They organized first aiders and mental health professionals. They even secured a massive public address system specifically so the crowd could hear the speakers from far away, preventing them from bunching up and violating social distancing.
They were applying best-in-class event management to a public health crisis.
Exactly.
But the insurmountable problem was the uncompromising nature of the law itself at the time.
The lockdown.
Yes. All of England was under Phase 6 of the national lockdown, specifically governed by the Tier 4 regulations.
Right, the tier.
And the mechanical reality of Tier 4 was brutal. You could not legally leave your home without a reasonable excuse, and outdoor gatherings of more than 2 people were strictly banned.
And the tiny legal detail that caused this massive explosion is buried in those tiers.
Yes, it is.
Because in Tiers 1, 2, and 3 of the lockdown laws, the word protest was explicitly carved out as an exception to the gathering ban. But when lawmakers drafted Tier 4, The protest exception was completely removed.
Completely gone. The regulations were explicit. In a Tier 4 area, organizing a gathering of more than 30 people in a public outdoor place was a criminal offense.
Wow.
And the police were granted sweeping powers to direct people to disperse, remove them, or use reasonable force to break up the gathering.
Okay, so if RTS had all this infrastructure, the QR codes, the marshals, the PA system, and the report notes that local Lambeth officers were initially engaging with them in good faith, why did the police suddenly shift from dialogue to actively threatening the organizers?
So the pivot occurred during a highly consequential virtual meeting at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday, March 11th.
Okay, what happened there?
Officers from Lambeth, officials from Lambeth Council, and the RTS organizers all logged on. But prior to this, the police had consulted their legal services department.
Ah, the lawyers got involved.
Exactly. In this meeting, the police presented the organizers with an open letter explicitly stating the vigil was illegal under Tier 4.
They didn't just say don't do it, though.
Oh.
They introduced the Serious Crimes Act.
They did. The police warned the organizers that by continuing to plan the infrastructure of the event, they could face arrest under the Serious Crimes Act for encouraging or assisting others to commit an offense.
Specifically, the offense of breaching lockdown.
Right. Because intelligence models showed that the anticipated attendance had surged far beyond a few hundred locals. Interest was tracking at around 6,000 people.
6,000? That's huge.
It is. And from a purely bureaucratic law enforcement perspective, regardless of LED tea lights and volunteer marshals, a crowd of 6,000 people during a peak pandemic wave is a public health disaster they are legally mandated to prevent.
That threat of arrest under the Serious Crimes Act is the exact moment this transforms from a local park dispute into a high-stakes constitutional clash.
Oh, absolutely.
RTS organizers were essentially told they would become criminals for facilitating public mourning.
And rather than backing down, RTS escalated.
Good for them.
Yeah, they worked through the night, launched a crowdfunding campaign that raised £37,000 almost instantly, and retained lawyers to take the Metropolitan Police to the High Court the very next day.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to look at the mechanics of the law.
Yes.
RTS didn't just argue that they were being careful. They argued that secondary legislation, which are the quick emergency COVID rules passed by ministers, cannot just override primary legislation, which are the foundational laws passed by Parliament.
Right, the big stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Specifically, they invoked the Human Rights Act of 1998. They pointed to Article 10, freedom of expression, and Article 11, freedom of assembly. And they argued that expressing grief and protesting systemic violence against women fundamentally constitutes a reasonable excuse to leave the house, overriding the Tier 4 ban.
But the Metropolitan Police countered by arguing that their hands were completely tied by Parliament.
How so?
Their logic was that because lawmakers had intentionally included the protest exception in Tiers 1 through 3, but deliberately deleted it for Tier 4, it demonstrated a clear legislative intent.
An intent to prioritize public health over the right to assemble.
Exactly. When infection risks reached catastrophic levels, they claimed they had no authority to ignore that mandate. Meanwhile, you had figures like Harriet Harman MP, chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, writing to the Met Commissioner asserting that if social distancing was observed, the vigil was perfectly lawful.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a police commander here.
It's tough.
It feels like an impossible catch-22. I mean, if you strictly enforce the Tier 4 law, you are caught on camera threatening grieving women with arrest while they mourn a woman killed by one of your own officers.
It's an optics nightmare.
It's the worst possible PR. But if you explicitly authorize the vigil, you risk sparking a superspreader event that makes a mockery of the national lockdown, while setting a legal precedent that anyone can ignore the health mandate if their cause is righteous enough.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at how Mr. Justice Holgate navigated this in his High Court ruling on the afternoon of Friday, March 12th.
Right. The judge, what did he say?
Well, he didn't issue a blanket approval or a blanket ban. He clarified that human rights under Articles 10 and 11 are not suspended by emergency regulations. They still apply.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Therefore, the concept of a reasonable excuse requires the police to conduct a highly fact-specific balancing act for every single proposed gathering.
Wait, so the court essentially said human rights do still apply, and a protest could be a reasonable excuse, but the police still refused to budge.
Essentially, yes.
Walk me through how the police justified maintaining their ban after a judge told them human rights were still in play.
The key phrase in the ruling was fact-specific balance. The court said police have an obligation to engage and consider if an event can be held safely. However, following a National Police Chiefs Council meeting, and with strong pressure from government ministers to strictly enforce the lockdown, the police maintained their hardline stance.
Okay, so they dug their heels in.
They did. They argued that conducting a fact-specific balance for an uncontrollable crowd of 6,000 people was impossible in advance.
I mean, I guess logistically that makes sense.
Right. They could not grant the organizers blanket immunity from prosecution because they could not guarantee that every attendee would adhere to COVID's secure behavior.
And without that guarantee of legal immunity, reclaim, these streets felt they were out of options. The risk of crippling fines and criminal records was just too high.
Way too high.
So on the morning of Saturday, March 13th, they officially canceled the event and asked the public not to gather. But, as the rest of the day demonstrated, you cannot legislate human emotion.
You really can't. The legal framework succeeded in forcing the official organizers out of the picture, but the public simply bypassed the legal framework entirely.
Thousands of people descended on the Clapham Common bandstand, regardless of the cancellation.
Yeah. And how does a peaceful vigil turn into a chaotic clash with 9 arrests simply because the organizers stepped away?
Right, that's the big question.
Well, the report breaks down the mechanics of the failure perfectly. It started peacefully at 6:00 p.m. with a solemn minute's silence. People were laying flowers and lighting candles.
Just like they wanted.
Just like they wanted. But because the police had forced Reclaim these streets to abandon the event, the physical infrastructure vanished with them.
Which is the crux of the disaster, honestly. Because crowd dynamics dictate how people behave in large masses. RTS had planned for a massive public address system so that someone standing hundreds of feet away could hear the speakers clearly, allowing the crowd to remain dispersed. Without that PA system, human nature takes over. People naturally physically compress inward toward the center of the bandstand to hear what is being said.
And as they compressed inward, the nature of the gathering changed. It went from a quiet, socially distanced vigil to a tightly packed, dense rally.
People brought microphones and protest placards.
Yeah, and once that crowd became densely packed, it became a glaring violation of the Tier 4 health mandate.
So the police, operating under their orders to disperse unlawful gatherings, moved in.
Right. The mechanics of public order policing rely on specific tactics. When a crowd reaches a certain density and refuses to disperse, standard police doctrine involves officers moving in coordinated lines to physically break the crowd apart.
Right, crowd control 101.
In a vacuum, this is standard procedure.
Right.
But applying standard crowd dispersal tactics to a dense group of women mourning a woman murdered by a police officer created an unimaginable spectacle.
The result was totally catastrophic. The police made 9 arrests. Photographs and videos flooded social media showing male police officers forcefully grabbing women, pinning them to the ground, and dragging them away from a vigil.
It was harrowing to watch.
It really was. It looked like the state violently suppressing a community's grief. It sparked universal outrage, drawing condemnation from the Mayor of London and the Home Secretary, and directly triggered the independent inspection report we've been unpacking today.
And this raises an important question about the limitations of rigid bureaucracy.
How so?
Well, the police were executing a strict health mandate, but by refusing to compromise on the letter of the law, they inadvertently created the very thing they feared.
Oh, because they got rid of the organizers.
Exactly. By threatening the organizers, they removed the safety marshals and the audio equipment, directly causing the dangerous crowd compression.
Wow.
And then their attempts to fix that compression provided visual evidence of the institutional callousness the public was protesting in the first place.
So what does this all mean? It brings us right back to that idea of an autoimmune response.
Right.
The emergency regulations were enacted to protect the physical body of the public from a deadly virus. But when those rules were applied without any human nuance, they actively prevented a traumatized community from healing a psychological wound.
Yeah.
The system broke down because it couldn't distinguish between a reckless superspreader party and a necessary act of collective mourning.
It's a tragic failure of context.
It really is. For you, the listener, we hope this deep dive has shed light on how the tragedy of Sarah Everard didn't just expose agonizing fractures in public trust and systemic failures regarding violence against women.
No, it revealed the raw mechanics of state power.
Exactly. It showed us exactly what happens when inflexible emergency legislation forces a devastating confrontation between a grieving public and the authorities.
It demands that we look closely at how the mechanisms of the state fail when they cannot adapt to the emotional reality of the citizens they govern.
And that leaves us with a final lingering question for you to explore on your own. When emergency laws are rapidly enacted for our physical safety, like during a pandemic, how do we accurately measure the hidden cost to our psychological need to collectively mourn and demand justice? And if the power to define what constitutes a reasonable excuse to protest is left entirely to the interpretation of the very institution being protested against, well, who really holds the power over our fundamental right to assemble?